like to welcome everyone and thank you all for taking time to join us this afternoon for another of our College of Liberal Arts e-talks. My name is Justin Mahalka and I serve as the Executive Director of Development for the College of Liberal Arts. Today's discussion will focus on rethinking the Spanish influenza pandemic in the time of COVID-19. The Spanish influenza pandemic, which lasted from 1918 to 1920, infected over 500 million people worldwide and killed over 50 million. And the worldwide response to COVID-19 has many people wondering how human societies dealt with pandemics in the past. In addition to considering how our ability to technologically and medically respond to pandemics has changed in the centuries since the Spanish flu, today's discussion will focus on why epidemics and pandemics are fascinating to also consider from the perspective of the humanities and the social sciences. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's faculty expert, Dr. Christopher Rose, with the Department of History here in the College of Liberal Arts, and who's a historian of the 19th and 20th century Middle East. Dr. Rose earned his doctorate in history from UT Austin last year and serves as a postdoctoral fellow in the department and with the Institute for Historical Studies, and also serves as a lecturer within the history department. Dr. Rose is an active public historian. He founded the podcast 15-Minute History and served as co-host for 8 years and is serving as immediate past president of the Middle East Outreach Council. Chris also has significant experience in educator training, particularly working with world history and world geography educators. He's conducted numerous professional development sessions for educators, co-written several curriculum units for K through 12 classrooms, and escorted numerous groups of educators to the Middle East. Dr. Rose, thank you so much for being here and leading today's discussion. It's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you to Angie, who's not on the broadcast, and the College of Liberal Arts staff for reaching out and inviting me to do this. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and see how this goes. Let's see how we do. There we are. Okay. So I'm going to try really hard to keep my remarks to 30 minutes, which those of you who know me personally will understand that that's a real challenge for me. I've never been accused of being pithy in my life, and I don't expect it to start anytime soon. But in brief, I'd originally thought about discussing the so-called Spanish flu, and I'll explain why the title is in quotation marks in a moment, in light of what's been going on with the novel coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in the time since I submitted a title and abstract for the talk, I thought that I might be actually revisiting COVID-19 in light of what happened with the Spanish flu, or at least trying to synthesize these two historical events together, and also sort of explain why they're being compared so much, particularly in the media and by policymakers. So I'm going to open with a dramatic moment of my own making, which is that a few months back, I had a brief moment of internet stardom when I responded to a tweet made by a sitting U.S. senator. This is Senator Grassley from Kansas, who said, "I don't understand why China gets upset because we refer to the virus that originated there as the Chinese virus. Spain never got upset when we referred to the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. And my response went a little bit viral there. As you can see at the bottom, it had over 200,000 likes at one point. I think a lot of those people were bots, and so they've since been deleted their accounts because that number has gone down a bit. But there's a couple of things I wanted to just sort of, let me restart this over. There's a reason I wanted to use this tweet as a launching point, because number one, there's a number of things about what he says that are either inaccurate or problematic. And I thought this would be a good way to launch into the social elements of disease and pandemic. I also discovered that there's a lot of people out there that really don't like China, which is a little terrifying, as well as a surprising number of people who think that viruses are a hoax. That was new to me. But I want to focus here on three particular aspects and use this as the sort of springboard. And so this is the general trajectory that I want to discuss today. So first, I want to lay out the general trajectory of the influenza of 1918 to 1920, to revisit what it was and why it looms so large in our memories, especially now. Secondly, I want to revisit the issue that I raised in my tweet, which is, why does it matter that the flu was Spanish, or that some insist on referring to the current outbreak as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, or to use more derogatory terms like Kung flu? And third, I'm going to wrap up my prepared remarks by talking about the epidemic as a social event, or to put it another way, why I'm a social historian, and I do focus on Egypt, as Justin mentioned. I'm interested in epidemics, which are usually thought of as medical crises. So let's jump in. So let's start off by talking about the general trajectory of what happened in 1918 to 1920. So here's some basic points about the pandemic. Apologies for the slide full of text, but the animation doesn't always work when you're doing it with Zoom, and I figured this is just easier. So the influenza pandemic has been identified in later years using laboratory and tissue samples that were kept as a mutated strain of the H1N1 virus that is the avian flu. It had an unusual mortality curve. This is how we are able to tell that what happened in this period in the three waves indicated early 1918, the fall of 1918 into 1919, and then from mid-1919 through 1920 were three waves of the same pandemic and not three separate waves of the influenza. We have very problematic numbers, and I'll touch on this here in a moment, about the mortality rates and infection rates from the influenza pandemic, part of which has to do with the fact that this was coming right at the end of the First World War. A lot of medical infrastructure had been redirected to the war effort, and so the number of people who were able to maintain accurate vital statistics really broke down, particularly in places that were hardest hit. So in 2002, there were two demographers and historians of medicine, Niall P.A.S. Johnson and Jürgen Müller, who attempted to recalculate the death toll of the pandemic. Their recalculation was that the disease afflicted at least 500 million with a B people, and that between 50 and 100 million people died, and that the average global mortality rate, the mortality rate being the number of cases that end in fatality, was somewhere between 2.5% and 5%. So one of the issues that we have, as I just mentioned, with understanding exactly how many people were infected and died from it, is that most of the sources that we have that give us relatively reliable vital statistical data are Euro-American. So basically, we're talking about Europe, mostly Western Europe, because it was in better shape in 1918 than Eastern Europe. North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Latin America, but we also have large swaths of the world for which we lack accurate data. And this is one of the things that Johnson and Mueller were trying to correct when they did their study. But outside of Europe, particularly, data is really spotty. And one of the ways that they tried to recalculate the data was by using the global median mortality rates and apply it to the known population of a particular region. So, for example, in their study, as they're going through various parts of the world, Egypt was the only country, or at the time it was a British protectorate, in the southern Mediterranean that actually issued a death toll of its own. In my own work, I've come to see this as a low number, probably by about 50%. But it's the only country in all of North Africa, and in fact, between Egypt and India, there is no data. So we don't have a number for the former Ottoman Empire. We don't have a number for the Arabian Peninsula. We don't have a number for Iran or Iraq or most of Central Asia. So there's this real lacuna in the research, and this is one of the things that medical historians and have been trying to look for. So for example, for a long time, if you look on this chart, the official number that had been given for China was 4 million, which would give it a very low death rate out of a population of 472 million. And so one of the standing theories about the influenza pandemic was that it must have come from China, or that it might have come from China because of the low death rate and the idea that the Chinese had some sort of natural immunity. However, one of the things that the demographers took into account when they went back was they thought, well, China was also just coming out of a revolution. The countryside was extremely disorganized. The vital statistical records are very problematic. And they realized that what was happening was that it wasn't that the death rate was low, it was that the number of deaths that were reported coming out of China were low, but in the areas that they were coming out of, they were in line with the global median, in fact, a little bit higher. So those are two very wildly different things, right? So this is one of the reasons why this attempt to find more accurate data from around the world has become important in historical studies. So this horrifying cartoon is from Great Britain. The outbreak was actually first detected at an army base in Kansas, at a U.S. Army base in Kansas, at the end of March 1918. Now, it didn't originate there, or it almost certainly didn't originate there. Although, as I discovered in the lengthy and vociferous follow-up to my tweet, there is apparently a very strong local oral tradition in the area around, it's now Fort Riley in Kansas, having to do with how the influenza originated there. And there are theories that it came from, and there are many and varied, that it came from somebody who worked with on a pig farm who got sick and brought it to the base. There's another one that said that it came from it was aerosolized at a factory where they turned dead animals into fodder for pig slop, essentially, and that it was transmitted through the air. Basically, the base was an incubator. The American Army was being dispatched, but people were coming to this facility from all over. And there's actually 3 other theories about its origin, that it came from China, and 2 separate theories that it originated in France. But what we do know is that it was reported at a military base in France sometime in April, and then from there it spread throughout the rest of Europe, and from Europe into the rest of the world, as well as out of the United States into Latin America, and so on and so forth. There were basically no parts of the world that were not affected by the pandemic. So it appeared on remote Pacific islands. In fact, the Kingdom of Tonga, the Pacific Kingdom, which had a very small population, under 100,000, but over 35% of the population died of the influenza. The few places that it was able to be, that were able to resist it, usually made the decision to quarantine themselves in. But it did have a relatively quick incubation period. It would appear within 3 to 4 days of exposure, but that was enough in 1918 to get across the Atlantic, for example. And a lot of people didn't really understand that this flu was different. And that's why I want to explain what made this flu different. So what you will see here are the normal, there are 2 lines on this graph, and I apologize, it's both low quality and the colors are a little hard to read. The red W-shaped curve with the peak in the middle is the influenza of 1918. The blue curve that starts at a peak and then just sort of gradually tails off to the bottom right is what is called clinical influenza, or basically the idea of, sorry, that was the clinical influenza rate. So those are the cases that were originally diagnosed as having been deaths from influenza. The W curve was deaths that were diagnosed from pneumonia. What was not understood immediately and for some time is that these two were the same, that it was the same illness. Because it's very unusual. Normally, I think everybody knows this now because of our talk about how the coronavirus is a strain of flu, which it is, although flu is a very, very large and dysfunctional family, is that usually it is the youngest and the oldest who are susceptible. This flu carried off the highest mortality was in patients between the ages of 20 to 30. In other words, adults who are at the prime of their life and had the strongest immune systems were the ones who experienced disproportionate numbers of mortality. And the reason why it was confused with pneumonia was because death resulted from what is called a cytokine storm. And this, interestingly enough, is the same thing that is the complicating factor with COVID-19. And I think this is one of the reasons why people are looking at the Spanish influenza. Basically, what this means is that the immune system is triggered into an over-response, and it causes the lungs to fill with fluid in an attempt to kill the virus, and victims essentially drowned. And now, today, medical technology has changed to the point where we now, these are the people that require ventilators. This is why there's such a need for them, because they're unable to maintain breathing on their own because of the pressure on the lungs that's resulted from the fluid and the need to be able to force the fluid out. At the time, of course, this was what became the notorious death rattle. So when you heard people begin to gasp for breath, they made this very distinctive noise, and it became known as the death rattle of the influenza. Patients also had a tendency to become cyanide; their skin would turn blue or black in the face, which again is something not normally seen with an influenza. So there was initial confusion about whether or not it was the flu, whether the flu was causing pneumonia, whether there was a strain of pneumonia also going around. And it was happening so quickly that it was only in retrospect that they were able to determine that this had all come from the same virus. So the public health response, a question came in advance asking if there were any similarities between the public health response to the Spanish influenza as opposed to COVID-19. And they're actually quite similar in that the American government was heavily criticized in both cases for not doing enough. President Woodrow Wilson apparently just felt that it was a matter for the Red Cross. He didn't really do much about it or direct the American government to do much about it. Ironically, when he went to the Versailles Conference in the spring of 1919, he reportedly came down with the Spanish influenza himself. Whether or not that changed his mind is uncertain, because the second wave of the pandemic was the deadliest. And that was the one that was seen in most places in the fall of 1918 and early 1919. Just to give you a sense of how fast the virus acted in Egypt, which is the case study that I'm the most familiar with, because I am first and foremost a historian of Egypt. It killed over 1% of the population of the country in the last 8 weeks of 1918, excuse me. And literally it happened within 8 weeks. By the time the public health officials there were able to wrap their heads around what was happening, the crisis had already passed. And so they were only retroactively able to start doing things, but by that point, it had happened too quickly. Just to give you a sense of the time frame, right? It's now July, and the first cases of coronavirus, COVID-19, were detected in December. So already we're in the 7th month, if you can imagine how fast that second wave hit, and the high fatalities. It's about double what we're looking at right now. So as you can see, much of the response was organized by the Red Cross. The other issue that really distracted, particularly in Europe and other parts of the world, is that a lot of the medical infrastructure, particularly doctors, had been sent to the war front. And so they were not immediately available to be repatriated and deal with issues at home. In places like India and Malaya, present-day Malaysia, you had private benevolence organizations that stepped in because the government was not able to respond effectively. In the United States, that took the form both of the Red Cross as well as local organizations normally charged with dealing with cases of tuberculosis. So you'll see here that face masks were mandated in the United States during the First World War, during the Spanish influenza pandemic. And you can see the poster on the left from Philadelphia reminding people to please use your handkerchief when you sneeze. So not much has changed on that front. So I want to switch a little bit to talk, what's in a name? Why is it important that the flu is Spanish? So I'm going to start here. This is from India, which is having its own tensions with China at the moment. This was a political cartoon that ran about 2 weeks ago in the Times of India, with Xi Jinping dressed as a panda, and the caption, of course, reads "Kung Flu Pandemic." And clearly, again, pointing the finger at China as the responsible party for the current virus. So one of the things that came up, again, in my initial Twitter conversation that I've seen repeated in other forums since, is that with the interest in the Spanish flu, there has been a lot of sort of defense of Spain. Spain didn't actually have anything to do with the flu. The reason why the flu is called Spanish is because in most of the countries that were at war, there was press censorship in place, and talking about lapses in health infrastructure was considered sensitive information that should not be given out, even though the main wave of the flu happened as the war was ending or after the war was ending. But these laws or regulations were slow to be repealed. And Spain was neutral during the war, and its press was not under censorship. And so it was the first press in Europe to recognize that this disease was really serious, that it had a high casualty rate, that it was having effects. Factories were being shut down effectively because not enough workers were showing up to run them. Schools were closing, and that a lot of people were dying. And elsewhere, where the press was under censorship, they would refer to the, cases of influenza have been reported in our cities. This appears to be the same influenza that was reported in Spain, where factories shut down and schools were closed, blah, blah, blah. And articles would go on to describe all the horrible things that had happened in Spain because of the virus. And this was a loophole that they were using to get around press censorship in their own countries. However, the reason Spain was neutral during the First World War was because it had been weakened very heavily by war with the United States. And so one of the interesting points that came out of this conversation was with several people who work on health in Africa who raised the point that it's interesting that people are so interested in rehabilitating Spain's reputation, but not, for example, places like the Ebola River Basin, the West Nile, which is now no longer a province in Uganda, but that's where the disease was first spotted, and all of these other diseases that come out of Africa that are named for specific places in Africa. And one of the prevailing comments is, well, Spain is white. And historically speaking, this is an interesting point because Spain is white now in the beginning of the 21st century. But it's very hard to see at the bottom of the caricature on the left where you see Theodore Roosevelt basically running over a bunch of Spaniards who look kind of like stereotypical Mexicans from the Warner Brother cartoons of the 40s and 50s. Is that at the time, this of course was also the time of the immigration debates in the United States, when there were concerns about allowing in immigrants from Southern Europe, immigrants who were generally described as being swarthy or having Latin blood, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, so they were racialized differently than Northern European Protestants at the beginning of the 20th century. These are distinctions we don't make anymore. And so I thought it was interesting. Spain was racialized at the time. So the name probably did have a racial component when it was attached. But we don't think of it that way anymore because our concept of race has shifted somewhat. And by the way, a number of other people who are from Spain popped up in the discussion to point out that they have actually been told at some point by foreigners, your country caused a virus 100 years ago that killed, 50 million people around the world. And so, yeah, the idea that Spain caused the virus, that it originated it there, failed to control it, and that's the reason it was named the Spanish influenza, is in fact alive and well. However, this is part of a larger social pattern that we see, particularly over the course of the 18th, especially 19th century, of using disease as a way to differentiate non-white, non-European populations. So, for example, when cholera first made its appearance on the global stage with the pandemic of 1817, it was identified as Asiatic cholera because up to that point, cholera was a generic term used for basically any sort of dysenteric discomfort. So basically anytime anybody had diarrhea, it was referred to as a variant of cholera. And that was referred to with the appearance of the disease coming out of Asia. The name was suddenly switched in Latin to normal cholera, as distinct from Asian cholera, which was the really dangerous one that could kill you in a matter of hours. And one of the things that would happen to victims of cholera many times was that because of the amount of fluid that they would expel as part of the symptomology, I'm sorry, this is a great lunchtime conversation, isn't it? Is that they would turn blue. So there's this lithograph from England in 1832, cholera, who is attempting to invade England, is a blue person dressed in an Indian turban, because the other thing that was made very clear by English scientists of medicine working at this time was that cholera was endemic to India, specifically to Bengal. And that the reason why the Indians had never developed a method for dealing with this was something civilizational, but basically they didn't care as much about human life as European Christians. And I really wish I was making that up, but I'm not. I actually I have quite a bit of primary source documents that actually express these sorts of attitudes about the quote unquote Oriental disregard for life. But for example, you may be familiar with terms such as darkest Africa. What made Africa dark? This is a lithograph of either Stanley or Livingstone, I forget which one, on one of their expeditions. But people who've been to the center of Africa usually point out that it's actually mostly grassland. It's not that dark at all. Well, the name was actually supposed to invoke fear and dread. And the fear and dread, of course, is that there are diseases in Africa that will kill European bodies. So much of medical study in the 19th century was about the protection of European bodies in foreign, non-European, non-North American settings. Even, for example, Florence Nightingale pointed out in this treatise that she wrote, I believe this is from 1868, she wrote a pamphlet, and it's called How People May Live and Not Die in India. So and the key here was an emphasis on filth, personal hygiene, and cleanliness, which it was popularly assumed was something that could only be upheld by the strict morals of European society. So one of the things, for example, there is a long history, and I will give credit where it's due here. Dr. Madeline Hsu, who's in the history department, has written a couple of books about the quote unquote yellow peril, or the Chinese invasion, which was this fear of the Chinese people and their low habits coming to the United States in the 19th century, which led to the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And so this is a cartoon from Puck, which is the illustrated magazine. And it's a bit hard to see, even in the original, it's a bit blurry, but there's literally a wave shooting out of a cannon of Chinese being shot into the streets of America. They're coming to invade. And this argument about whether or not the Chinese, the coronavirus should be called Chinese, is the latest manifestation of this sort of portrayal of the other as inherently diseased and inherently contagious. So I'll just point out here, and I can't, of course, I can't see a virtual raise of hands, but I call it the legend of the bat soup. So the Wuhan outbreak, which started in the fall of 2019, November, December, the first cases were that this was something new and unusual, which is what we mean as when we say that the disease was detected, was in central Wuhan, in this area around a seafood market. Hundreds of thousands of people pass through this area. Wuhan has 11 million people. It's just a few blocks from the train station. So it was very easily passed to commuters who were coming in and out of town all day long. So about, I want to say January, February timeframe, there was a news team that went to Wuhan, knowing that this was the area that the outbreak had come from, around the train station, and that it seemed to be clustered around the seafood market. And knowing that coronavirus is predominantly found in bats, they discovered that there was a food stall in the seafood market that sells bat soup. This was the beginning and end of the evidence that patient zero, if there is such a person, contracted the virus by eating bat soup. But the legend carried on. It's been repeated by government officials. People shouldn't eat bat soup. Nobody made us eat bat soup. Again, nobody's actually ever proven that this is how it started. Statistically speaking, most diseases are passed from bats to humans because somebody has picked up and handled a diseased bat. But the idea that it might have been a sanitation worker who found one laying on the ground, somebody out camping for the weekend around China, or go out for a hike around in the Chinese countryside, might have been bitten. These stories did not get legs. The bat soup legend got legs. And one of the things to think about is why? And I'm already over time. Hey, look at that. But I'm just going to wrap up real fast here. So what is what is interesting for humanities historians, or people of the humanities, history of the humanities, about epidemics? More to the point, the question really is, if an epidemic is a higher than normally expected number of cases of a disease that spreads widely, what makes an epidemic as opposed to a virus doing really hard to win the yearly MVP award? That is, after all, what viruses are supposed to do. They're supposed to make their host sick and then reproduce and then be passed on to the next host. And this isn't a new idea, but in particular, this is a quote from Roderick McGrew writing in 1960, others have picked this up, is that they provide moments of abnormality through which normal behaviors and concerns can be seen. So intensifies a situation to the point where people act in ways they might not normally act, but they're acting on impulses they already had. And particularly for, say, the Spanish influenza, when I'm talking about that large swath of the world, we don't have really reliable data for, or any data for at all. These are areas of the world, I mean, even Egypt, where I work, 90% of the population was illiterate. Most of those people were poor. But what I can tell by looking at press coverage and people writing about the epidemic is that those poor people suddenly want things. And you get a sense of what they've been lacking for the entirety of the wartime. To give you an idea of how this works, there are two things going on now that have parallels with the pandemic 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, during the Spanish influenza pandemic in the United States, there was a huge problem, particularly getting men to wear face masks because they were considered feminine. And there were a number of advertising campaigns that were made specifically targeting men, using militaristic language. In particular, they were trying to go for men who had just come out of the armed services or been in the war, to say, you know, it's your patriotic duty to wear a mask, or in this case, this is from the US Shipping Board, stop spitting on the streets. So the idea, again, that people, that liberty is somehow being threatened by orders to wear face masks or use personal protective equipment is not new. It has precedence in the past. So what we're seeing today is perhaps being exacerbated by some of the false information or misinformation that circulates on social media, but it's not a completely new phenomenon. The other thing is the emergence of social fault lines. The pandemic of 1918-1920 coincided with a number of revolutions and uprisings. Now, here, I think this is a more interesting case, and this is my last slide, so everybody can just sort of relax. I'm almost done here. But did COVID cause the current round of protests relating to Black Lives Matter? No, obviously that did not. I was in high school in the 1990s when the Rodney King thing beating happened, and the protests over that. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it in Ferguson. We've seen it with Trayvon Martin. We've seen it emerge at a few different times in recent history. The question is, what's different about this one? Why is it that when I went to Amazon.com a couple days ago and I looked at the best-selling books, they were all authors of color, or they were books about anti-racism. What is different about this moment, and what is that the pandemic has overlaid tension onto an already tense situation? So Americans are tense about the political situation in the country. It is an election year, and I don't think I'm saying anything too controversial when I say that this is a particularly tense election year, with people anticipating the results of it. That there's a lot of people who feel that the government's response to coronavirus has not been sufficient. And we're also all stuck at home. I'm at home right now. Our lives have been disrupted. And what a lot of people have is more time. They have more time to flip through social media. They have more time to watch the news. And what has emerged is this, this sense of this social justice as something, okay, here is something productive I can do. You can't protest a virus, right? I can't protest COVID-19, or I could, but in the popular imagination right now, health workers are frontline workers. You're not going to go protest at a hospital. That's not productive. However, this is a way, this COVID, the pandemic, has provided people with, it's sort of lit a spark. I feel trapped. I feel like I have to do something, and here is something productive I can do. So it'll be interesting 100 years from now to see, when people are writing the history of 2020, whether or not COVID factors into it at all. But again, it's one of those things where this is an underlying cause. It's not that people are protesting because of COVID, but it's an added layer of pressure that has made the difference between why the protests this time have taken on a new dimension that they didn't take in the past. Okay, I am way over time, and I apologize to the organizers. I also apologize because I did not, and I meant to include a slide with my contact information, but so I am going to turn it back over to Justin to moderate the questions. Thanks everybody for bearing with me here as I've babbled on for a little bit.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate that. And you'll see some questions starting to pop up here in the chat. But before turning to those quickly, just a couple that have come through as well. Wonder if you could speak a little bit about, if you think there's any perhaps danger in looking for historical precedent in previous epidemics when the virology is so different. Or, yeah.
So one of the things that's been really fascinating as being on my end of things, right, is how living through the current pandemic has actually helped me understand things I didn't understand about the past. One of the things that put me onto the Spanish flu in Egypt in the first place is that it's not in any of the histories of Egypt. And I looked at the death toll, and then I looked at how the death toll probably needed to be recalculated. And my first question was, why do I not know this story, right? This is the period I work on. And I literally made a point of pulling the major histories of Egypt during this time period, and it's just not there. And so one of the things that I realized now is, oh, okay, this is why. People are living their lives. They're not going around thinking about the pandemic all day. They're trying to maintain a sense of normality. And the war, interestingly, was such a heroic moment that the idea that people were dying back on the home front of a virus is such an unsexy thing. And I see Ben Wright's question in the chat. And this is And this is was something that the New York Times wrote about a month ago. There are no monuments to the victims of the Spanish influenza in the United States or Canada, and I think there's only a handful in Britain, just because there's no heroism there, right? It's not an interesting story. So there are interesting parallels. You can't obviously go point for point. Okay, this happened in 1347, so it's going to happen in 2021. But you can pick up on historical trajectories and things that offer explanations. So I'm actually developing a class for the fall where we're doing history of medicine, but we're starting with COVID and moving backward, just so that we can sort of pick up, okay, what do we understand about this moment? And then with that in mind, we can move back into looking at past pandemics.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and next question is kind of multi-part. What do you think is the best global history of the 1918 and 1920 pandemic, or the best undergraduate-friendly statement of epidemic as a social event? And then what do we know about relative vulnerability of soldiers on the home front, countryside, et cetera?
Okay, I can supply a reading list because I see who the question writer is. Hi, Judy. So Alfred Crosby's History of the Pandemic is good. There's a couple other ones that have come out that are pretty decent and more general reading. And of course, the authors are flying right out of my head as I'm thinking about them. The PBS series, The American Experience, did a show on the pandemic, which I believe is online to stream. As far as epidemic as social event, yes. Christopher Hamlin's book, Cholera, the biography, has at its introduction a restatement in much plainer language, and that's the one I'm going to be using with my fall class. And I'll include that as well in the reading list that I can send, and then you can share it with the attendees later.
That'd be great. Happy to do it. All right, Chris, this one we're asking you to look in the crystal ball a little bit, but I'm sure this is on a lot of our minds. Any thoughts around if there's an end in sight to the pandemic? And with people protesting closures and going around without wearing masks, which you referenced, of course, with the Spanish flu pandemic, is that prolonging the virus, et cetera?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that one of the reasons why people are frustrated is that those benchmarks that were promised by the government that we were going to be testing, and we were going to be testing at X number of levels, we were going to reopen when we hit them, all went out the window. Texas was actually, credited as being one of the first states to embrace the shutdown, but then reopened without meeting its own benchmarks. So that's another step that's in there. Is masks are an easy way to allow people to be in public without the possibility of cross contagion or delaying cross contagion, but it's a stopgap until something else happens, and that something else is ultimately going to have to be a vaccine, which I'm hearing we're probably still at least a year out from that. But yeah, the more that as I read in an editorial the other day, what seems to have happened is that people have decided it's been 4 months and I'm tired of it, so it's done, and it's not. So we as a society kind of have to adopt a little bit of a different attitude during this time. And it's hard. It's really hard. I'm looking at another question. There were protests in 1918. There was actually an anti-mask group with chapters in several cities that was formed. by men who had just come back from the war, and they're like, I wore a gas mask in the trenches, and I'm not wearing anything on my face again. Because they were veterans who just come back from the war, that carried some weight. So it is interesting unfortunately, everybody gets really tense when I remind them that the flu pandemic lasted 3 years and it's been 7 months. But we do have is the ability to produce better vaccines. But the thing about the face masks is, like, and we're seeing the result right now of people going out without them, is that what it's meant to do is to give our medical infrastructure a break. Just because a hospital has 3,000 beds doesn't mean all 3,000 can go to COVID patients. If they only have 5 ventilators, that's as many people in critical condition as we can treat. And if you have more than that, then you wind up having to make decisions about who's going to get access, whether they can be transported to another hospital. And that's what they're trying to avoid. It's not about eradicating the virus completely. It's just about reducing the strain on our infrastructure while we put measures in place to deal with it. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Great. So another, asking you to look into the crystal ball again here, Chris, but when you of course did a wonderful job looking back, 100 years ago. What do you think, if anything, what are the future, the Dr. Chris Rose 100 years from now? What is Chris going to say about this current COVID-19 pandemic?
Probably a lot of the same things that I'm saying now. I'm fascinated to see, even though I'm not an American historian, I'm fascinated to see if the social protest movement that's going on right now is going to have legs and result in any sort of real change. And if so, whether or not the pandemic will play a role in that. I think it will certainly play a role in the histories that are written of the Trump administration. Because his response to it has been, is already being credited as a major failure of the administration. And Texas historians will I think be fascinated by the disconnect between the governor and the lieutenant governor on this issue. Because you have Abbott saying we need to go back into lockdown, and Patrick on television saying that we should stop paying attention to Fauci because he's not saying anything useful. So it'll be interesting to see whether COVID returns as a factor in all of this, because sometimes it's there underlying. The other thing is that this happens to be happening at the exact moment when the environmental medical turn in history is a thing. So this kind of work is being done with a number of diseases and in a number of different places, but it's also really fashionable right now. So it'll be interesting to see if that plays a role in it as well. Good questions coming in.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine the two of these and may end up serving as our final question. But so the combined question is, how can we, and you've touched on some of this, but how can we reference the 1918 pandemic when talking with people today, particularly those who may not want to wear masks or may not be taking the current pandemic as seriously as others may want them to? And then wondering if you think there's any validity to reopening or attempting to preserve and maintain the economy, considering the potential longevity of the pandemic, and if you could speak to maybe what the common response was in 1918 on that topic.
Okay. So there's another question I'm going to toss into the mix here that I'm seeing in the chat, which is there greater patience 100 years ago than now? No, there wasn't. One of the ways I did my research was I read the Egyptian press, or as much as I could get of it, for the entirety of World War I, because my work actually goes on disease through the entirety of the war. Is that there were people writing into the papers complaining that the cinemas have been shut down because of the pandemic, and what am I supposed to do with the kids? They're at home bored. So in terms of how to get people to take it seriously, well, the first thing is this. You cannot win an argument on social media because nobody goes to social media to get to have their mind changed. Okay, so just accept what you can control. But ultimately, the other thing is, I think the point I made earlier is that the mask thing is not about necessarily the idea that you're going to prevent people from getting infected entirely. What you're trying to do is give doctors a break. And just slow it down a bit. And I think because there's a lot of people who are saying a bandana doesn't filter out the virus, and it doesn't. But the virus is contained in spit and saliva, and if you sneeze on accident or whatnot. But ultimately, I mean, they didn't fix the problem in 1918, and they're probably not going to fix it today. Is that, you know, people who just aren't going to do it aren't going to do it. Usually, from what I can tell, what usually lights a fire under somebody's butt is that they know somebody who's contracted it. And in the US, this is particularly important because we appear to have the dominant substrain here is the one that came in via Europe, from China to Europe to the US, which is not as age discriminatory as the one that came directly from China. In other words, you know, 50% of the cases in the US are people under the age of 40. And so this myth that it's only old and young people who can get it is just that. It's a myth. And that's one of the things that people, I think, really need to be conscious of. Is it's not just about, you know, keep it, you know, the old or the young, but anybody can contract it. But ultimately, this is a hard lesson to learn. I would argue, in response to the last part of the question, that the economy is not shut down. What people mean when they say the economy is shut down is that services are not functional. So we can't go out to dinner. We can't go to the movies. We can't get our hair cut. And that is certainly a large a section of the economy, but it's not the economy in its entirety. I think there are ways to do it. I think the question is whether or not they're economically viable. So, I mean, I know when restaurants were first allowed to reopen in Texas, the number didn't, because 25% of the dining room being full was not enough to pay the staff. There was a little bit of an economic dip after the pandemic. The economy had recovered by 1923. And then, of course, went on to crash again in 29, but there's no established correlation. So in as much as people are out of work, and that's bad, if we do get something out of the earlier pandemic in terms of what the economy might look like, it did recover quickly once people were allowed to resume life as normal. It took a couple of years, but it wasn't, you know, decades of depression. I mean, so it may not be immediate, but ultimately what we have to do right now is try to take care of each other. You know, and there's a number of funds that have been set up for, you know, people who are out of work, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, this is a time to, you know, to really look after your neighbor, which would also involve wearing a mask. So again, but that's ultimately what it comes down to, is the communities that did the best during the pandemic were the ones that arranged large charitable contributions to help with the slump. You know, if there's a way to begin sort of thinking about, okay, what can we do if there are growth industries, if we're going to be dealing with home delivery for a long time, or, you know, personal shoppers for a long time, are these areas where people can start looking for work? You know, we're just sort of in that transition phase where it hasn't happened yet because we're not sure. And so, you know, I think the nature of temporary or hourly wage work jobs is going to change substantially if this lasts much longer.
Thanks, Chris. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you again, Dr. Rose, for your time and for this wonderful presentation. And thanks to all who attended. We really appreciate it.